Bob is a retired educator who enjoyed a 33-year career with the Lambton Kent District School Board, counselling secondary school students. He has delivered numerous sessions on democracy over the years, including to various community groups and to third-year students at Western University. And he has engaged with the Sarnia-Lambton Immigration Partnership to introduce new Canadians to our system of democracy and voting rights. He's a volunteer with the Samara Centre for Democracy, which is a non-profit donor-funded organisation dedicated to strengthening democracy through greater citizen engagement. So Bob's title is Can Democracy Survive if Elections Are Its Only Focus? So please welcome Bob Sutton. Okay, well, thanks. We might need to raise that up a little bit. You can hear me pretty well with it here? There? There you go. There? You need to get fairly close. But... Need to get fairly close. Okay. I want your answer to that. I don't want to tell you what it is. Because generally, we need to spend far more time listening to what citizens have to say than talking at them all the time, which seems to happen. Before I begin, I do have to say how good it feels for me to be here in the loving and supportive atmosphere that emanates from you as a cohesive group of people who really have a respect for humanity. The world needs more people like you. At the same time, I don't want to bore you. I'm going to try to keep my remarks to 20 minutes because the topic's just democracy and elections. How significant is that? And I have to say, in reducing my remarks, I left out a couple of comments on artificial intelligence, and I may find a way to work that back in. But basically, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about obviously elections and their role in democracy, using the context, of course, of the coming US election. And I'll touch on things like purpose, expectations, communication, money, and our role as citizens beyond 2 minutes in a polling booth. So elections in theory were to do the following things, and I'll want to know whether you think that's being achieved in elections or not. They were supposed to promote discussions of public issues, facilitate the expression of public opinion, to confirm our worth as individuals in society, and through the vote itself, legitimize the acts of those granted power. And in the ideal world, elections were to bring focus to what we have in common, this thing called the will of the people. So I'll be interested in knowing whether you think that's being achieved by elections or not. You know, on the one hand, we can be overwhelmed into immobility by the complexity of things that confront us. And at the same time, we can be driven to withdraw by the polarization of oversimplifying what's coming at us. And sadly, I think elections have come down to celebrity politics and blood sport, winner take all, as we watch the drama that media presents. There are no quick fixes, even though they're promised, and I think we're losing any semblance of, I gotta move over a little bit, this mic blocks my vision. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, great. There are no quick fixes, even though they're often promised, and we're losing a sense of equilibrium in many dimensions of our society. And that's a bit of a focus I want to get to. It's not the question of right or wrong, but the question of regaining some equilibrium. And let's get a look at the United States. You have been thinking about it a bit? Yeah. Before I talk about specifics, let me give you a look at societal change in the US over the last several decades. At its very core, the US is seen to exalt individualism to the point that it shows sometimes a pathological disdain for the common good. And as an example of that, of all 38 OECD countries, Organizations for Economic Cooperation and Development, of 38 countries, only Poland, Greece, and the United States do not have universal healthcare systems. But the US spends more than any other country on healthcare, 16.6% of its GDP, while at the same time, US citizens are carrying $220 billion of healthcare debt, accounting for 62% of all personal bankruptcies in the US. And speaking of debt, the group carrying more total debt than all of that on credit cards and automobiles is students, student debt. And the inequitable funding of education in the US is rampant, and I can't go into detail at the moment, but it is rampant. And ultimately, a prof at McMaster, who's from the States, said that all we do with our education system is help students get a leg up in our economic system, but we do nothing to educate them to be fully functioning citizens in a healthy democracy. And when it comes to income in the US, there's been a complete reversal since the 1970s. In the 70s, the bottom 50% of income earners brought home 20% of the total income. Now they bring home 12%, and it's slipping. In the 70s, the top 1% of income earners brought home 11% of income, and now it's now it's up to 20%. So a complete flip. And the top 1% of the wealthiest people in the US spend more than 40% of all the money that goes into electoral campaigns. And I haven't even touched on I had a bit more data there I wanted to give you. It doesn't matter. In the US, in 2016, $14 billion were spent on elections, which was double that and it was doubled in 2016. Right today, there are 2,746 super PACs in the US that have already raised $3.7 billion in the first 12 months of the election period. And is there any here who hasn't heard what Elon Musk is doing? Volunteering randomly $1 million to someone who signs his super PAC petition. Just a quick reference to the difference in spending between the US and Canada. In Canada, in an election year, an individual citizen can donate a total of $5,175 to our political process. In the US, 2014 legislation allows any one individual, as many as wish, to donate $1.3 million to an election campaign. I hope this short overview brings me to a concept I want to mention. We can't go into detail on it, but it's this. It's a quote. The last great global ideological showdown was between communism and democracy. Is the next showdown already in play? Democracy versus kleptocracy. Kleptocracy being this: the capture of politics and the economy of a country by networks of business tycoons, political leaders, and out-and-out criminals. It's perhaps safe to say that we've lost any semblance of balance when it comes to money and democratic process. Money dominates, but the imbalance of that is never discussed when it comes to elections. So a question I'd have for you at the end of the session, if you have the time for it, does limiting electoral spending help or make a difference? And might there be other ways to fund our elections besides donations? And there are ideas out there about that. I'd also like to mention the equilibrium, the loss of equilibrium within the marketplace and between marketplace and democracy. And part of that is directly related to the infinite advertising budgets of the marketplace. In his book, Brandwashed, which is a takeoff, obviously, on Brainwashed, Martin Lindstrom explores the insidious and universal nature of impact of marketing and how it makes a big difference between what we know and what we do. And it eventually even seems to set the agenda for how we live much of our lives based on what we're motivated to buy and do with it. Remember, on average, do you remember this from the last time I talked with you? On average, how much do we spend in a lifetime? How much time do we spend shopping? 25,000 hours plus. So here's a quick example of how the marketplace promotes our spending, just around food and marketing. More people are now dying on the planet from obesity than from hunger. Unbelievable. Since 1990, obesity has doubled amongst the general population, and it's quadrupled amongst those between the age of 5 and 19. In spite of our being at the best stage we've ever been for understanding quality eating and all of the efforts that has gone in to put labeling on foods, we are marketed to death to buy and eat junk food, and only 3% of all the ads directed at children have anything to do with healthy eating. And one other quickie I have to mention about the marketplace and kleptocracy in the end is sports betting. Have you noticed a bit of that? Yeah. Well, just to give you a couple of specifics, each of those sports betting companies spends on average $1 billion a year in marketing. But it pays off because in the US, citizens in 2023 bet $120 billion on sports events. And in Canada, we spent $10 billion. But when it comes to donating to democratic process or political parties, only 240,000 Canadians donate, and of them, 9 out of 10 donated less than $500. So when you think about the competition that political parties have with budgets to get to us compared to what the marketplace is, it's just no contest. But at the same time, there's this really abstract question that is in democracies all the time. How much marketing benefits or hinders the health of a society? And what role or what right does democracy have in trying to find some equilibrium in marketing in the marketplace? The simplicity of marketing is in the political domain. Forgive me, I'm not trying to offend any particular political party. This is just what's been in my face very recently. Axe the tax. Canada is broken. It says nothing about the issues, what has led to the issues, what the outcomes of those decisions might be. There's no context, there's no understanding. It is just often to influence us with some degree of fear or money in our pockets. So communication generally and around elections, and this is another one for our question period, if you have the time or want to ask it. What's the difference between media and journalism? The definition, if you were to discuss it. And what happened to all the money that citizens used to pay in newspaper subscriptions that they're now unwilling to pay anywhere? Where did that money go? And what's happening with the quality of professional journalism? And when's the last time you saw in journalism a news article that actually summarized a year of legislation successfully passed that had a positive impact on the dynamics of our society? Fundamentally, all we ever see is what's wrong and never an indication of what's right. That makes us want to give up. We really need to regain some equilibrium. So, got to give you this quote. Holding government to account has gone from using healthy skepticism to using malignant cynicism. Ask me in question period to read a short little thing from a citizen that will exemplify that. So when it comes to communication around democracy generally, 2 quick quotes. Democracy may have moved us from bullets to ballots, but we have never moved past the language of war and political process. Think of all the commentaries around battlegrounds, attack ads, fights to the finish, winning the war over things like illegal immigrants. And the other quote, political discourse has become overwrought, uncalibrated rhetoric incapable of constructive conversations about very complex issues. And do you know that 2/3 of all MPs in Canada, including cabinet ministers, interviewed about 4 years ago, 2/3 of them said, question period is a gong show. Do you ever watch question period? Would you describe it as a gong show? Yeah, yeah. So finally, around communication, and this is a critical one. In a recent book, At a Loss for Words, Conversation in the Age of Rage, Karloff emphasizes that we rarely stop to define any of the words we use. And if we don't understand the definitions, the fundamental meanings of words we use, then the ideas themselves get lost. And she's got a number of words in your book. Take a look. I'll mention a couple. Woke. How many times have you heard woke? And how many people think of it differently? And what has it come to mean? It's simply now confrontational and polarizing, right? Freedom? What do we mean by freedom? Timothy Snyder in the US just published a book called On Freedom, and he's published several others, and it in itself is worth a whole read. Truth, taxes. What exactly do we mean by those? Fundamentally now, they're all used not to inform, but to inflame and evoke emotion, if not fear. And whenever there's talk about limiting misinformation that comes from social media, there's often the outcry of freedom of speech, limiting freedom of speech. Ask me in question period about what Maria Rosa, recent winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, had to say at a conference I attended recently. But in the meantime, I got to give you this. Traditional news outlets once curated information for veracity and balance, for truth and balance. In stark contrast, social media curates not for veracity, not for truth, but for advertising velocity. And sadly, even professional journalism competes for financial survival in the marketplace by constantly presenting the drama of what's wrong. But let's remember, Canadians, you are amongst one of the most educated populations in the world. We don't need to be told what to think, but what we need to do, which is rarely done, we need to take more time to search more on our own. We just can't expect someone is going to know exactly what I need to know today, and they're going to plop it in my lap today. We have to learn to do more digging, take away a few of those 25,000 hours from shopping and commit them to a little more understanding and action around our democracies. And if you think that fear and emotion in democratic communication is overwhelming us beyond any good facts and information, what can you do as citizens? You who sit here today, what can you do to regain some balance in political discourse? And quickly moving to the question of democracy in general and equilibrium, there's rarely any discussion of our expectations of democracy, and I think that's in part. Aldous Huxley said, the writer, said, human beings have an almost infinite capacity to take things for granted. If I vote every 4 years, democracy will just carry on. I'd remind you that the reality, the very core of democracy is controversy and frustration. It's allowing infinite perspectives on any issue to be heard, and unanimity is never an outcome. So if you don't like controversy and continuing compromise, you might not like democracy. And in fact, a lot of people, because they don't like the controversy and find it agitating, simply turn away. And when we turn away, we leave power in the hands of the very few for whom we'll feel the most contempt. I'll never forget a prof I had way back in my university days who said, you kids got to understand that democracy is not all about peace, harmony, and light. It's about achieving enough compromise that we don't kill one another. But the significant question for me revolves around not the frustration of infinite controversy, but around the way it's carried out. And that's where we have a problem. In the words of Donald Savoy in his book, Democracy in Canada, The Disintegration of Our Institutions, citizens have become too easily dismissive of political process, and politicians have become too comfortable with the status quo. So we really have to look at ourselves as citizens, not always point the finger at others. And while they deserve a better finger pointing, putting it all on the shoulders of politicians is what helps us destroy our democracy, because we put it all in the hands of a few. So if we really look at ourselves and our own dismissiveness, we got to remember what Nelson Mandela once said: if you want to change the world around you, consider the fact that the first thing you might need to change is yourself. Change the way you think, change the way you act, change the way you communicate. So in the face of our dismissiveness, we have to think carefully about how that dismissiveness might contribute to the outcomes of elections and the conduct of those we elect. That's the kind of discussion we need to have. But ultimately, the loss of equilibrium in democracy goes beyond dismissive attitudes to real passivity, and how many citizens actually actively engage in politics beyond 2 minutes in a polling booth, and 40% of us don't even do that. So another question for you in question period, if you're still around, and if you don't doze off, how often have you heard people say, my vote doesn't count? What makes them say that? What do they actually mean by it? And what do any of us actually expect of our votes? Worthy conversation. John Ralston Saul, one of my favorite writers, said democracy is the only system of achieving some semblance of equilibrium or balance, and the key to its success is the involvement of the citizen. On the flip side, Philip Paven, a UK researcher in politics, says it's time to give up on the idea of widespread participation. We have to find ways to get democratic outcomes without expecting a lot of participation in the process. So I could make it confrontational by saying, do you agree with Paven or do you agree with Saul? And that's the kind of confrontation that we can get into fairly quickly. So instead, we could ask this question: how much citizen engagement is enough to keep a democracy healthy? And how do we define that engagement, promote it, and assess it? Those kinds of conversations can occur much more readily without confrontation. So we really need to, as citizens, examine why so few of us participate in democracy, why so few of us vote, and then just begin to propose some actual remedies. And a couple of quick quotes before I get on to talking about us. The best way to defend democracy is to study it. Civil society requires civic literacy and media literacy, and it is needed not only amongst youth, but also amongst adults. It's hard to trust someone or something you don't understand. And much of the research I've read suggests that neither Americans nor Canadians really understand how their democracy works. How many of us, for instance, could write a 500-word summary of how legislation even comes to be pondered in the first place in our society, how it's formulated, how it's ultimately written, and how it's actually passed? Some of you in here could. I have seriously found your group to be the most open-minded, compassionate, and flexible people who recognize already the need for equilibrium rather than winning and losing over confrontation. Which brings me to us as citizens in our democracy and in our elections. As I said, we can be overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we see, but we can overcome being overwhelmed if, firstly, we exercise our capacity for critical thinking, which we have. And secondly, recognize we can't fix everything, but that doesn't mean we do nothing. If we can exercise our patience in seeking change and remembering that change is a process over time, not a moment in time, then we can perhaps begin to engage in something that in and of itself leaves you feeling like, what difference is this going to make? But if you think that way, nobody does anything. We can choose amongst any number of things that we might want to do, learn about, act, and contribute. Doing things like Alan McEwen does with Climate Action Sarnia-Lambton, what Roseanne did in Petrolia to save its hospital, what Helen Cole is doing to motivate women to enter politics, what Michael and Allison, two people, did to start Samara, which now has a Canada-wide impact, or how Duff Conacher started Democracy Watch that has over 70,000 Canadian members now, and what you as Unitarians have done and continue to do. In the 1980s, You protested the transfer of obstetrics from the Sarnia General to St. Joe's because it meant that women no longer had the option of tubal ligations when their babies were delivered. In 2000, you were the only religious community to walk in Sarnia's Gay Pride Parade. In 2003, when same-sex marriages became legal, you were the only religious community willing to officiate those ceremonies. And you remember in 2015, you hosted a public forum to bring public attention to the need for MAID, medical assistance in dying, and the Canadian Unitarian Council was granted intervener status at the Supreme Court of Canada, which eventually approved marriage equality. So let's accept the fact that simply because we can't do everything, we can still do something, and we must. So you pick your spot and get engaged without being overwhelmed. So here's the spot I'm going to suggest that we pick together. It's reducing the degree to which elections have come down to celebrity politics and toxic communications by starting with our local candidates. And forgive me, but the teacher in me led me to bring a couple of handouts today. 2 of them up here, and there's a few to go around. The first one is entitled, Question Candidates Beyond the Platform of the Moment. All it does is provide some questions you can ask any candidate at any public event or debate. And here's the key. You know that many people there are going to ask questions about platforms. The focus for you, for us, is to ask about democratic process rather than platforms. And here's just a couple examples of the ones that I have on the desk here. Many MPs say they cannot figure out ways to have thoughtful and effective communication with their constituents. This is what you're saying directly to the candidates, right? So, do you have ideas for ways to communicate with Sarnia-Lambton constituents beyond the typical mailbox flyers we all occasionally get? And another one, several nonpartisan groups in Canada, Samara amongst others, have identified a critical need for real civic literacy, understanding how our democracy actually works. What would you do? What do you think citizens need to understand about our democracy? And what would you do at a local level to promote civic literacy? And there's one there on my favorite thing, citizen assemblies. I think I've mentioned those to you before, and we could talk about them if you'd like. The second handout I have relates to my personal theme of judging a little less and learning a little more. Because lots of research shows that the second you pass judgment, you can stop thinking. The problem is hers. She can figure it out. So judgments made too quickly shut down thought and shut down the communication. So my second handout refers to, as I said, the thing about judging a little less and learning a little more. And you can use your search engines to get to all of these. I'll just mention a couple of them. One of them is, okay, sorry it comes up, it's my favorite. MASS, M-A-S-S, LBP. And the LBP stands for Led by People. And it gives you a clear picture of how citizen assemblies can work and can be organized. Back to my kleptocracy comment, there's one called The Thieves Are Uniting, TVO, April 7th, 2022. And it's a good look at the whole question of kleptocracy. There's another one called Can Trust Index, and it gives solid research on the levels of trust amongst Canadians and government. And hey, just for fun, on a scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'll just get 2 or 3 of you to answer. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being outstanding trust and 1 being basically zip, how much trust do you feel in your political scene generally in Canada? Scale of 1 to 10. Anybody?
1.
1? Okay. 6? Everybody else afraid to answer? Brad, come on, you could do it. 4? Okay. Okay. 4? Isn't it worth some discussion amongst citizens about trust? And another one of the questions I have for leaders at debates rather than platforms is, what can you do to engender more trust amongst Canadians in political process so that they feel like they belong and they can actually have a part? So I trust that you've been getting the theme today, that paying attention only to the momentary urgency of campaigns and looking for simple answers to complex issues just reinforces that definition of insanity we've all heard, doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So I did propose some questions that I might ask you, but I'd rather have you ask or comment as time permits. Alan?